Forbes. I think this is not my 10th Montgomery Summit, but it is my 9th, and I know for sure I was there at the very first one. Jamie has many talents, and one of them is impersonating a general. But Jamie will explain why there's been a switch. You know, you ever go to see a play or the opera or something, and they'll announce that so-and-so will now be played by another actor. So Jamie's fulfilling that role, but it doesn't diminish from the conversation that they're going to have. At our recent Forbes Global CEO Conference in Singapore, among the worries that global CEOs expressed, the number one worry was geopolitics. And as somebody put it, an accident. Something happening that nobody could see, not even a black swan, simply mildly well-intended people misinterpreting what the other one, what their intentions were. So this just couldn't be a better topic. Karl Theodor zu Guttenberg will join Jamie on stage. Karl Theodor, but everybody calls him KT. He was distinguished by being a member of the German parliament, and he was the youngest Minister of Economics and the youngest Minister of Defense in modern Germany's history. I think who else, can you think of an American politician who was once Secretary of the Treasury and one Secretary of Defense in their same career? Caspar Weinberger was. Was there anybody else? Did he and George, no, George Stolt was state. But anyway, sort of a rare twin feat. Today, KT is an investor. He's chairman of Spitzberg, a group in New York, and then he is runs his own firm out of Munich. And one other thing about KT is that he's a really inspiring speaker and a prolific podcaster also. So look him up and look up a TEDx speech that he gave in Berlin not that long ago. It's about TED, the TED and TEDx formulas. It's only about a 15-minute talk, but it's really pretty terrific. Jamie's the one guy around here about whom you can fairly say he needs no introduction. I just want to say this about Jamie. You know, when AI takes everybody else's job away, it just keeps going up like a Pac-Man doll, taking ever higher orders of intelligence jobs along the way. The last job that it will take, the two last, I think Steph Curry and Jamie Montgomery. Steph Curry, because the athleticism, that's going to be really hard to do even in a robot. And I think the power of convening that Jamie brings is something that artificial intelligence, because it's so personal based, and that that'll be the last thing that AI will take off the table. So Jamie and KT, would you please come up and get the panel going?
Well, KT, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, KT has a daughter at UCLA, and so we're lucky to have him come visit us. Occasionally.
What you say now? Was that the main reason? Or?
No, it's just a great excuse to get you out here. And you can tell your daughter you're coming out to see us, and you tell us you're coming out to see your daughter. It just kind of works that way. I have a daughter as well.
That's how I try to maneuver it.
Yeah, exactly. So 2 weekends ago, President's Weekend, it's a weekend where Navalny was assassinated, and KT and General Allen, unfortunately couldn't be here today, were at the Munich Security Conference.
Right.
And the assassination of Navalny and subsequent announcement seemed to be timed to Mrs. Navalny, the widow, to coincide with her appearance at the conference, and a form of really trying to intimidate her and the West, like he's eliminated so many opponents over the years. And that moved me to think that this is really, really a dire situation that we're facing in Europe. And you have a very aggressive Putin, and this is a gentleman who's known that about Putin for well over a decade and tried to warn Merkel about this, the dangers of being reliant upon.
She didn't want to listen.
She did not want to listen. Yeah. So let's go back. So you know, tell us about the Munich conference. What was the sensation around that, and where were you when you heard that Navalny had been? Yeah.
So, Jamie, it was once again an extremely well-planned scenario by Vladimir Putin. He knew where he could set the message. And Navalny appeared extremely healthy, not extremely healthy, but somehow healthy 2 days before he was assassinated. And I'm deliberately using the term assassinated here, when he had a court appearance at this place where he was incarcerated. And so to create a shockwave in Munich was definitely a goal by Vladimir Putin. And he succeeded somehow. Why do I say somehow here? Because he did not count on Navalny's wife stepping on stage. And she had a choice there. She could have, and this is what she said as well, she could have gone right away to her kids and just hug her kids, which would have been the right and emotional thing to do. But instead, she actually stepped up on stage and gave a very strong message, and a message that really left some marks amongst those sitting at the Munich Security Conference, and all of them there, let's say, know how to spell emotional distance properly in their normal life. But they were definitely touched, and not only touched, it triggered deeper conversations on what the hell should we do with Ukraine and Russia and the wider conflict scenery around Europe.
Incredible situation. And you're sort of watching this slow motion train wreck happening with Putin in Europe. You saw this early on. What was the first indication on Putin and his intentions? Yeah.
So I met him a few times, and in the early 2000s already, I started to warn my fellow Germans and tell them there is at least something to consider here. He might not be that lovely, embracing personality he tried to leave as an image, especially to the Germans. And he had a way to actually really get close to the German soul, because his German is quite sophisticated. He speaks almost flawlessly, as he was positioned in Dresden when he was still working for the KGB at that time. And so he had a way to address the Germans. And then he started in quite an intense way to foster the energy ties between Germany and Russia, which were already existing for almost 2 decades. But he pushed us more or less into a full dependency. And he did that in a seemingly lovely and kind way. However, at that time already, there were signals of aggression taking place around Russia, and we had Georgia at one point, South Ossetia. We had Chechnya a few years before that, and then I said, guys, just try to see the other option here, or the alternative. However, nobody really listened, and that's the fate of a politician who's a lonesome player. And then it took us until actually February 2022 to realize what kind of character he is. And I have to admit, we were in absolute REM sleep for many years, not only in Germany, but also in the rest of Europe.
Yeah.
And also over here to some extent.
Yeah.
I remember someone saying I looked him into his eyes and so on. So so we have seen a certain development at certain stages around the globe.
Well, we'll talk about the European side. They've really disarmed and now trying to rebuild. Part of it is energy, self-sufficiency, importing LNG, recommissioning plants, rebuilding the arms industry to be able to build weapons again and whatnot. How long will it take for Germany to kind of reindustrialize some of these important parts of the economy?
Well, a while. And,
Yeah.
and if we look at Germany as the third largest economy in the world, which we
Yeah.
still are, we have created three more or less full dependencies.
Yeah.
One was energy, we already touched upon that. The second one, security. We are fully dependent on the US actually being our safety umbrella within NATO. We can talk about that a little later. And that, of course, was one of the big questions at the Munich Security Conference, as we heard a couple of interesting sentences coming out of an interesting mouth from over here just a few days before that.
Right.
And the third dependency is our trade connection, specifically with China. And some of them are tightly interconnected. So you cannot separate, for instance, energy and our move towards renewable energies, toward challenging climate change, from certain dependencies with China that the US could never fulfill, that Europe has not in Europe, and that is all the rare earth, the materials, the minerals that are needed to actually move fully and successfully move into a new era of energy independence. And
So you don't have
for
those in
that, we
Europe.
do need China
Yeah.
still. And,
Yeah.
and as much as we hear all the grumbling and mumbling coming from over here, separate your ties from China, it won't happen. And it won't happen for many other European countries as well. And this makes the whole constellation even more complex. And that feeds into the third dependency, of course. How do we structure our security alliance, mainly NATO, if we still have these kinds of ties that we desperately need over there? That, of course, also offers investment opportunities if we talk about chances and other things, but that's a different topic. So in Munich, let's say the elephant in the room was, the main elephant in the room, and it won't come by surprise to you, was, let's call him an orange elephant with blonde hair.
Yeah.
And who just gave us a lovely notice a few days before the security conference when he said, well, if these guys don't pay their share within NATO, Russia can do whatever it wants to do. And so you can only imagine how enthused the Europeans were about that message. And it shows a rather dramatic development also when it comes to NATO and to our transatlantic alliance.
Yeah, it's a real breakdown in the long-standing consensus on foreign policy in the United States. It's really troubling, but, you know, it's real. I mean, it's I don't know. It's a tough one. Okay, so how do you play this hand? You know, if you're the Chancellor of Germany.
Well, I'm happily enjoying a free life. Well, a couple of things I think we need to do, and as we are talking here at that summit also about, let's say, topics that were not on the top of the list of the Munich Security Conference, but should be top of the list as geopolitical factors. Jamie, one, of course, and you're very much involved in this, is everything taking place in technology and artificial intelligence. Yeah. Another one is, of course, the question, where do we go when it comes to the big movement towards decarbonization? And where Europeans try to push a little further than some do over here. And how do we, so where are we here? And if we look at the decarbonization process and what's needed, we're looking at an interesting but also rather dramatic lack of infrastructure around the world. So when it comes to renewables, for instance, we do need the power grids actually to deliver what needs to be delivered. And we saw an interesting number around the globe right now. I think we have around 80 million kilometers of power grids at the very moment. It's like 2,000 times around the globe. In 2030, it will be around, the necessity is 104 million kilometers of power grids. So with these 104, just again to ask the question, who actually is providing the infrastructure?
Yeah.
Nation states as such, governments don't have the power any longer to do so. So it needs to be an interaction between the private and the public sector, on one hand. Secondly, we also need whatever is needed for that. So for an additional 18 million kilometers of power grids, you would need 30 million tons of copper, for instance. So where does the copper come from? So these things are questions where you could come from an investor's perspective, but you could also come from a geopolitical perspective. And it is, let's put it that way and put it mildly, it is under-discussed. And that's something that didn't take place in Munich. Last point on that. This is what happens when you invite Germans. They don't stop talking. Last point on that is, if you consider what's the most vulnerable geopolitical target at the very moment, and how do you make a safety net around that? It is the energy sector. You're very much invested in cybersecurity as well. So, and you definitely know that it's 39% of all targets connected to cyber attacks are directed or targeted at the energy sector, and so these are the links we have to see, and I think that's also what offers opportunities.
Yeah. All right. So, I mean, I think we've been kind of bailed out over here with AI. I mean, we should have gone into a recession. We somehow avoided it yet again. We had the stimulus after COVID. We've had this, quote, soft landing. We probably had a lot of stimulus. Now we have this productivity growth. We have this big boom coming of AI. What's the sentiment in Germany right now? Is it negative? Is it gloomy? Is there any green shoots over there? Or, I mean,
so the first reaction always is if you talk to Germans and to some other Europeans,
they look for the bad.
They have, let's say, a tendency to skepticism. That's a diplomatic phrase I'm using here right now. And when it comes to skepticism, it is always connected to our obsession to regulate. And yes, there is a necessity to come to regulation here, but it shouldn't be the only European answer. And if I look at what's popping up in Europe and also in Germany, there are a couple of interesting companies there dealing with AI. But the difficulty we have is always the next step. And not the next step into an A round, it's really into growth stage. And for that, it's a mindset issue. So the mindset issue is we are not as prone to take certain risks as you are over here. And so our risk-averse mentality leads to the tendency of over-regulation on one hand. Secondly, not to push these companies at a level where they could be. And yes, they might be a bit more stable at certain stages, but they're not as competitive then. And this is actually what worries me.
I think we correct more quickly over here. I mean, we just, it's like, that ain't working. We're willing to shut down things, lay people off,
That's a little harder over there.
It's harder, So, all right, personally, Rich talked about a recent talk you gave in Berlin. That's on, tell us a little bit about that talk.
The TED Talk I gave there.
TED Talk,
That was very personal. It was actually driven by two factors. One is I do have my deep concerns regarding the tonality we have in our societies at that very moment.
Tonality.
Tonality, and especially in the political discourse. And it very much also hinges on the ability and willingness to become a bit more personal in the interaction, respectful with each other, but also to reflect on yourself a bit more, which is something that normally doesn't work in politics. Or superficially doesn't work
No, it clearly doesn't.
In politics. However, I think there is a way and there's a growing demand for that. And the TED Talk actually was about my very own experiences in that very circus tent, political circus tent. Secondly, also on what attention does with you. So attention is you can gain attention, you can be the subject of attention, but you can also give attention, you can lose attention, you can withdraw attention, all these things. But what does it do with your mindset? And how do you deal then with, for instance, failure at the top level? And I have my experiences with failure. And so it is a very personal talk about that, and also an offer for those who are in top positions to sometimes rethink their approach to attention. And so that's the main talk. Quite a bridge from what we were talking about before.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think, you know, most of the people here speaking or here are high achievers, and they're trying to do something meaningful. And then balance, you know, what's meaningful with family and you know, other priorities they have in life. And, you know, and, you know, being a leader in an organization or a sector, or, you know, takes certain skills, you know, and being able to have empathy or listen and not get distracted by the attention you get is very important. And I think, you know, I find so many times when you're around prominent individuals or politics, there's zero chance they're listening to you. They're preparing what they're going to say next.
Right, and they're rarely willing to talk about weaknesses as well.
Yeah.
And personal experiences that were not just shiny and hyper successful.
Yeah. And I was asked to speak at the local business school, their incoming students, and I got up and talked about all of our great failures. And you could see the students looking at me wondering, why the hell they invite this guy? I thought maybe they'd learn something, you know. And you know, and I spoke to a Wells Fargo conference a few months ago, and before it, I asked Charlie Munger, and I got Warren Buffett on the phone. I said, you know, I'm going to go talk to these couple hundred bankers. And the first reaction, why are you doing that for? You know, I said, oh, I've been banking with them for 30 years. I owe them one. I go, okay. Tell me a couple stories. And so they tell me this story about Carl Reichardt. And he was the original CEO, and they bought like 1 or 2% of Wells Fargo, and then they, you know, and they made this acquisition, and they couldn't figure out why they bought this company. So they called him up and said, Carl, you know, we like you, and we like that, but why do you make this acquisition? It doesn't look like a very good acquisition. And Carl said to him, you know, gentlemen, you're right, I had my head up my ass. And Warren and Charlie decided, this is great. We love this guy. He's honest. And they bought, like, you know, tripled their position in the company, became the largest shareholder. And how many people will ever tell you that they have their head up their ass, right? Mm-hmm. You know, I never have that. So, and I told that story, and there were like hundreds of people there, and they were like, this is so refreshing, because no one ever wants to admit they're wrong, made a mistake, you know, be vulnerable.
I made a couple of quite significant mistakes.
Absolutely, we all do, right?
How do you deal with that kind of
failure
or experience afterwards?
Yeah.
And we have a tendency.
And that defines you ultimately, is how you.
It does or it doesn't.
Well,
because the question is how do you. What's your next step then, and how do you regain a certain amount of balance? And we all do have a tendency in our lives to spend numerous amounts of time on the irrevocable past, something you cannot change anymore, something that has happened, and something, of course, you learn your lessons out of that.
Yeah.
And the second thing is, the second big amount of our concentration there is on what's going to happen in the future.
Yeah.
Instead of concentrating a bit more on the present.
Yeah.
And which really
be present. Be present. And that's why I came back to the question about how would you play the hand in Germany? Because you're sitting here in the U.S. and you say, okay, Russia's a problem, China's a problem, Iran's a problem, but all three of those countries are run by complete nutcases who have no idea what they're doing. They're screwing up their countries. So there's maybe a 20% chance of war with each of them. But if we can navigate that and really get our own act together rather than, education, immigration,
Right.
all the things we got to deal with, looking forward, we can just run away with the prize in this country. But we're not even having that conversation, right? And I wonder, why aren't we having that conversation? Why isn't, like in the Munich conference, why isn't that at the agenda, at the top of the agenda? Why, and it's a really interesting conversation. That's why I came back to it, because what you're putting on the table with that talk sounds like that was the most important thing. And it's so, in businesses or in government or in any institution, how do you really kind of take the most important subject and get it on the table to talk about? Like, you go to Carl Reichardt and say, well, why do you do that? And he goes, I had my head up my ass. You go, great.
Because most of them are dead afraid to fail.
Yeah.
And they're dead afraid to say something where they might be nailed against the wall by at that very moment, or by investigative journalists going after them just afterwards. And they don't have, let me provoke a bit, they don't have the willingness any longer to fail.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's necessary.
Yeah, well, if you're afraid to fail, you're afraid to succeed. Yeah.
You are.
Yeah.
Definitely.
All right. So KT, closing up, we come back a year from now, what should we be talking about in Germany? We'll get through. We had a mild winter last year. They're sorting some of the stuff out. What do you think happens the next year over there?
We might have to talk about Europe as a structure.
Okay, Europe.
We might have to talk about what does it mean if someone gets re-elected over here for the stability of the world. And that's something we need to be prepared for already right now. Are we? No, we are not.
Yeah.
What does it mean for a couple of big topics? I talked about decarbonization. My friend Arnold Schwarzenegger is sitting here, and he's really someone who is actually...
Is Arnold here? Hey, Arnold. How are you?
Living that topic. Deglobalization is taking place on the other hand. It's, you have so many things, as I've said, that are intertwined and interconnected, and we probably will have to talk about a pretty new world order that might be pushed in a certain direction by someone, and that's something we are afraid of in some parts of this world, who is, yes, someone who actually forced us to step up with our military engagement and all these things, or with equipping our forces sufficiently, but who is lacking the necessary historical knowledge, who is lacking the necessary willingness to find compromises where you need them, and who needs to see the world not only as a transactional element. And that's something I think we need to talk about next year, because that it could shake the world in a way we don't like to see.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Well, KT, thanks for being here. Thanks for being a friend of ours. And thank you for everything you do to keep our lines between Germany and the U.S. strong. So thank you for being here.
Pleasure. Thank you.